All the elders of Israel assembled and came to Samuel at Ramah. And they said to him, "You have grown old, and your sons have not followed your ways. Therefore, appoint a king for us, to govern us like all other nations." Samuel was displeased that they said, "Give us a king to govern us." Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord replied to Samuel, "Heed the demand of the people in everything they say to you. For it's not you that they've rejected. It is me they have rejected as their king. Like everything else they've done ever since I brought them out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and worshiping other gods. So they are doing to you. Heed their demand, but warn them solemnly and tell them about the practices of any king who will rule over them." Samuel reported all the words that the Lord had spoken to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "This will be the practice of the king who will rule over you. He will take your sons and appoint them as his charioteers and horsemen, and they will serve as outrunners for his chariots. He will appoint them as his chiefs of thousands and of fifties, or they will have to plow his fields and reap his harvests and make his weapons and the equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters as perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will seize your choice fields, vineyards, and olive groves, and give them to his courtiers. He will take a tenth part of your grain and vintage and give it to his eunuchs and courtiers. He will take your asses and put them to work for him. He will take a tenth part of your flocks, and you shall become his slaves. The day will come when you will cry out because of the king whom you yourselves have chosen, and the Lord will not answer you on that day." But the people would not listen to Samuel's warning. "No," they said, "we must have a king over us, that we may be like all other nations. Let our king rule over us and go out at our head and fight our battles." The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of the Lord lives forever. This is the word of the Lord. All thanks be to God. So who do you serve? Or who is it that you think you serve, but meanwhile choose to serve someone else? That could be a possibility as well. Last week we heard from the prophet Isaiah when he met face to face with God, the Almighty who reigns above us all, in this great vision. And now this week, being familiar with Isaiah's vision of God up there on the high and lofty throne watching over us with seraph angels flying around, simply the sound of God's voice causing earthquakes and smoke to fill the temple, and just the hem of God's robe filling the temple. As we are familiar with that glimpse of the power and glory and grace of God as Isaiah saw it, now we hear about the people in the prophet Samuel's time, some generations before Isaiah. Here we find the people of Israel requesting a king to rule over them. Sure, they already had a king, the creator of the entire universe, but hey, they wanted a human king. Now, it shouldn't be too surprising to us, right? If you happen to read last week beyond the scripture that we were talking about, just a few more verses, you probably saw God explaining to Isaiah how stubborn these people were going to be that he was going to be speaking to. Not only that, we also know as people, we trust more in what we can see than in what we can't see. And, a lot of that comes just from gaining wisdom of living in the world. We've got more than plenty of liars and scammers and charlatans among us as human beings. We've all run into people who will just try to lead us into trouble if we take them for their word. Living life as a person teaches you that you're going to run into people who will lie to you and who will only take advantage of you, who will tell tall tales to get something out of you. And so we have been learning, rightfully so, as we should, to guard ourselves from that and to only believe what we see. I think that's part of it, but that's just a big part of us people, is seeing is believing for us, and especially functioning according to human wisdom. Now, although there are benefits that come from this, definitely some good things in us protecting ourselves, things that should not be lost, we get this message that John read earlier from 2 Corinthians relating to this passage, where in 2 Corinthians we're being led to look at something beyond our human wisdom, something even greater than our human wisdom, to not be confined by our human wisdom, where we are reminded that we function according to a higher power, a higher wisdom than our own. Where it says, we look not at what can be seen, but what cannot be seen. For what can be seen is temporary, what cannot be seen is eternal. Now, of course, this 2 Corinthians passage is talking about us keeping the faith in times of suffering. So when we're suffering, when we're hurting, that's not the thing we should simply be looking at, our suffering, to decide what is real and what's not, whether God is really involved with us, whether God is really on our side, whether we're going the way God is teaching. You know, like it talks about in the book of Acts, very early Christians, they were hunted down, they were dragged out of their homes, they were beaten, sometimes they were even murdered. And those who didn't get caught went out in the countryside looking for safer places to be, to go tell people about Jesus. Now, if they simply went by human tradition and human wisdom, functioning by what they could see around them only, one might conclude that God was against them and was against this whole Jesus thing. Now, sure, this whole Jesus thing was an absolute beautiful way of life for believers, only until someone came knocking at the door to punish you for it. Therefore, this message kind of reminds us of who we are. It reminds us that we have committed ourselves to God's will. And it reminds us that our trust as people of the faith must be placed in something even greater than the greatest of our human wisdom. That is, if we are to be what God has called us to be. God knows we struggle with this, and that's why God gave Isaiah the vision last week. And that vision led right up to Isaiah's calling, and that's probably not a coincidence. Getting to see by way of a vision the eternal presence of God, it blew the hinges off the closed doors of Isaiah's mind. Once he saw God in that vision, there's no more problem. He was finally able to allow his unclean lips to be purified because of his new overwhelming sense of trust in God that he had been placing elsewhere before. Before that vision, I don't think he trusted God enough to change whatever his misguided ways were. After that vision, he was all in. Mind, heart, body, and soul. He was all in. The human kings of Israel were no longer the top of the food chain in his eyes. He could see the creator of the universe there at the top, the one who goes unseen. Now, normally by our human wisdom, a king who goes unseen is no king at all. I love the story of Edith Wilson. Edith Wilson, her husband was President Woodrow Wilson. When President Wilson suffered a stroke, and along with some other serious health issues, he became incapacitated. He couldn't continue doing his job as president. He was bedridden. And although the public became aware somewhat of his health issues, they weren't aware of how incapacitated he was. Started to become suspicious, but Edith Wilson, who had managed things for him before when he was out campaigning, she was not only there to care for him, but she was there to take up his business as president, to manage his affairs as president while he lay there in bed incapacitated. From 1919 to 1921 when his term ended. As it was said in an article, that may very well mark the first time in American history that a woman became the de facto president of the United States, even if Edith Wilson never officially held a post. Woodrow Wilson, he had to go unseen because of his illness. And that certainly would have led to the people's trust in him completely failing just because they couldn't see him there doing his job. But that didn't happen because of Edith Wilson, because she showed him to be active by helping with the work that needed to be accomplished. by accomplishing that work. And likewise, she even showed him to be active as they posed for this picture. I love this picture because this is a pose. This is at a time when he was still incapacitated and bedridden, but he was sat up and modeled for this picture while she stood behind him. And if you notice, it's his right side showing of his face because the left side of his face was showing signs of the stroke. So they took this picture, put the picture out so people could see the president at work, and all of a sudden they were able to hang on to their trust in him serving in that position. Edith Wilson understood how important it is to see. She understood how important it is for us to have our seeing so that we can believe. Seeing serving someone that we cannot see, it goes against our human wisdom. And we know that. That's what we find today going on in the passage from 1 Samuel. For them, the people of Israel at the time of 1 Samuel, it was during the period of the Judges. At the very end of the period of Judges, Israel was ruled by these judges, basically chieftains, tribal leaders, leading different parts of the area. Some of them were more spiritual in nature. Some of them were more military in nature. Some of them were good. Some of them were bad. But none of them had the kind of power to do what a king could do. Again, they already had an eternal king. They didn't need a regular king. And they vowed to serve this eternal king. But they couldn't see this eternal king. So many, if not most, were convinced that they had no king at all. They looked to Samuel, but at that time Samuel had gotten older. They looked to Samuel's sons, but Samuel's sons, who were judges, had become corrupt. So they called upon Samuel to anoint a new king for them, a human king. Because having a human king, first of all, meant they could see a leader standing in front of them, and they could see a leader going before them into battle or into whatever. And beyond seeing is believing. A human king could force the people to unite on a larger scale, establish a larger, stronger army to at least have a fighting chance, if not totally dominate their enemies. What they didn't consider, though, was what God knew would come as a result of having a human king. Serving this human king that you want so bad is going to end up with your sons being taken and put onto chariots for war, to serve as foot soldiers. Any king you choose will appoint your sons en masse to make weapons of war and work the fields. That king will take your daughters as perfumers, cooks, and bakers. Your fields, vineyards, and groves will no longer be yours. Your grain and vintage will no longer be yours. Your property will no longer be yours. You will be, your lives even will no longer be yours. You will become subjects to the state. And once you realize the bad that comes along with the stuff of having a human king, then the problem is yours to deal with. Samuel told them all this, just as God had told them, relayed the information, but God's warning and this opportunity for them to change their minds, to that they said no. We must have a king over us, to rule over us, to go out in front of us, to fight our battles. Now, you know what may be the craziest part in all this? As they rejected God for a new human king that they hadn't even met yet, as they claimed and they believed themselves to be religious people, people of faith in God, who had already done so much for them. Yet their faith was not really in God. Their faith was in their own limited wisdom. It was confined to their human wisdom. They couldn't see beyond that. So much that they totally brushed to the side the divine wisdom they receive here in this passage. And they don't even realize they're brushing it aside. Which begs the question for us today. As people of faith, where does our faith lie? Where is our where is our trust? Where is our true belief? Do we put it in our favorite speaker, our favorite pastor, in the next popular person on TV, in our guns, in our military, in a certain group fighting for a certain cause? in a CEO, in a mayor, in a governor, in a congressperson, in a president. A person or people who then can rule over us, go in front of us into battle, be the one we see as our leader, as our ruler. Or does our faith lie in what goes unseen, the eternal presence of God? Well, as Jesus said, there's really no serving two masters. You can either serve one or the other. We've got to choose which one we really want. May our answer be the Lord, even though it sometimes goes against our conventional human wisdom to do that. As people of faith, may our loyalty not get confused, but be clearly placed in God. And although God is an unseen eternal presence, may our service to God show God's work being accomplished so people can see some of what God does here on this earth, so that we might all be helped to come to terms with our calling to share God's love throughout the world.